Here we go. So we've talked about eukaryotes, organisms with cells that contain a nucleus and organelles. And we've started talking about the kingdoms of eukaryotes. Animals you're familiar with, plants you have seen before, fungi, include mushrooms and yeasts and the fuzzy stuff on your leftovers in the refrigerator. And then protists, which is kind of where we throw everything that isn't an animal, plant, or fungus. And those guys are all over the map. Some are made of one cell, some of many. Great deal of diversity that we just haven't got time to get into in a course like this. If you really want to know, you can change majors. And we've talked about protists and fungi. So let's talk a bit about plants. You have, I assume, seen plants before, unless you grew up in a Skinner box. You've seen grasses and trees and flowers and bushes and so on. Almost all plants are photosynthetic, and they use a green pigment. The green stuff in plant leaves is called chlorophyll, and it's used to absorb solar energy, light from the sun, and convert that into a type of energy that can be used to drive chemical reactions, to drive metabolism. So plants soak up energy from the sun and build biomass out of small molecules like water and the gas carbon dioxide and a few minerals and things like that. There are a few plants that are actually not photosynthetic, and I'll show you an example of one that you can see around here if you're observant in just a couple of slides. But almost all plants are photosynthetic. Plant cells, like all cells, they're surrounded by a cell membrane, a flexible barrier between the inside and the outside. But outside of the cell membrane, there is a cell wall. Now, in bacteria, the cell wall often contains peptidoglycan. In fungi, the cell wall is made of chitin. In plants, the cell wall is made of stuff called cellulose. When a cell wall is mature, a plant cell can no longer expand. You could think of it as being like the wall of a room, right? If you have a room and you have walls in the room, it's not really practical to, try to make the room any bigger, right? You'd have to knock down the wall and rebuild the room or something like that. The upshot is that there are a lot of cells in a plant that have a function, but they're dead. The only thing that's left is the cell wall. The actual contents of the cell died a long time ago. And I'll show you some examples of that as we go on. But in a big tree, almost all of the wood on the inside of the trunk is actually dead cells. It's important. It holds the tree up and it conducts water from the roots up to the leaves, but it doesn't have to be alive in function. So these dead, empty cell walls actually are important. They play an important role in enabling the tree to stay alive. Outside of the cell wall, on the outside, there may be a wax layer called a cuticle. In some plants, this is very thin, but there are some very plants that have very thick cuticles. One example would be if you find there's some magnolia trees growing pretty close to Lewis, or you may know where magnolias grow elsewhere. And if you take a fresh magnolia leaf and you scratch it with your thumbnail, you can actually flake off some of the wax on the outside of the leaf. Holly, I think you can do this too. There are some plants where the leaves are so covered in wax that it's actually harvested. If anybody's ever heard of bayberry candles, that wax is actually harvested from the leaves of the bayberry plant. But even in plants where there is much less cuticle, it's still present, even in leaves that don't feel very waxy. Don't worry about detail in this picture. This happens to be a view through a microscope of a cross-section of a leaf. All I want you to see is that, first of all, a leaf is made up of many cells. In many of these cells, you can see the nucleus. The way this has been stained, the nucleus looks pink. You can see it well in the upper layers of cells. And I want you to see that the cells have different sizes and shapes and positions. So we have the outermost layers at the top and bottom. That's the surfaces that you would actually touch if you picked up a leaf. That's called epidermis. Inside, you have a layer of very elongated cells. It's called the palisade mesophyll. Below that, there's kind of an irregular layer kind of in the lower half called the spongy mesophyll. There's guard cells and there's vascular cells. Don't worry about what that's called. Just see here that you can see different cell types making up different parts of the leaf. This is just another example of cell differentiation. I will say there's a few plants that are not photosynthetic, and this is one that I've actually seen I live a little bit out in the country, and there's some pasture close to where I live. And every so often I'll spot some of this growing in one of the plants in the pasture. It's called dodder. The stuff that looks like yellow-orange spaghetti, or possibly the former president's hair. It's yellow, not green, because it isn't photosynthetic. It doesn't capture sunlight. It doesn't make its own food. What this does is grow as this tangle of very narrow stems, and the stems literally penetrate into host plants and take their water and nutrients. Under that tangle of yellow filaments, you can see there's a green plant under it. That green plant may end up dying because the dodder has penetrated into its stems and is slurping up that plant's water and nutrients. So there are a few plants that are not photosynthetic because they are parasites on other plants. And yeah, this is one that I have observed around here. Maybe you've seen it too, or maybe you will now that you know what to look for. But the vast majority of plants carry out photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the most common type of being an autotroph. There's a few others that we don't really need to get into. They run their metabolism on sunlight and build up large molecules out of small ones like water, carbon dioxide, nitrates, and minerals that are taken from the soil. To do this, they use a green substance called chlorophyll. Actually, technically, it's a mixture of two slightly different types of chlorophyll. We don't need to get into that. That's a diagram of the chlorophyll molecule. You certainly don't have to memorize that. I certainly would never ask you to write it down or anything. Let's just say that it absorbs light energy. It absorbs red and blue light and reflects green, which is why plants look green. The green is what bounces back, and the other wavelengths are absorbed. And chlorophyll is able to convert that into chemical energy by means of some really amazing chemistry that I wish we had time to go over because it's absolutely beautiful, but we have to keep on going. I would really like to make this course last an entire year and meet about 8 hours a day, and then I could actually show you some cool stuff. But as it is, we're going to skip over that part. Okay, that chemical energy that the plant harvests from light is used to take CO2, that's carbon dioxide, and water, H2O, and convert 6 molecules of each into a molecule of a simple type of sugar called glucose. Glucose can in turn be used to build more complex sugars, or it can be used to build other molecules, like the cellulose in plant walls is made of lots of glucose molecules stuck together. Or glucose can be burned as fuel to drive other metabolic reactions that the plant has to carry out, like making proteins. This, by the way, is the trunk of a maple tree up in maybe Vermont or possibly Canada. The maple has had a spout driven into it called a spile. And what you can see here is the sap of the maple tree is dripping out of the spile into a container. And then the sap is going to get boiled down until it thickens. And that's how you make maple syrup. Well, maple syrup contains glucose and other sugars that the maple tree made during the summer by photosynthesis. And then in the winter, you can tap into the maple syrup. Hopefully the plant has more than it needs. And so we tap in and get this sugar-rich sap and boil it down and put it on our pancakes. If you've never had real maple syrup, you should. It's so much better than the Mrs. Butterworth's artificial stuff. Right. Many plants contain other pigments that do various things. Plant pigments that are yellow are called xanthophylls. Orange pigments are called carotenoids. And then for red and blue, there's a class of chemicals called anthocyanins. And these are responsible for the colors of flowers, the reds and the yellows and the blues of flowers in spring, the reds and oranges and yellows and blues of fruits and vegetables. It's why your carrots are orange and your lemons are yellow and your plums are purple. And it's responsible for fall colors, like what you can see up in the Ozarks around about the end of October. The brilliant colors that you see when leaves lose their chlorophyll in the fall. Those colors are always present, by the way, but you can't see them until the chlorophyll disappears as the plant is shutting down when temperatures get cold. There's a close-up of some plant cells. I promise each one has a nucleus, but you can't see it without special stains, but it is there. Inside each cell, you can see some of these green lumps. That's a type of organelle. They're called chloroplasts, and we'll hear about them again towards the end of the course. There is a cell membrane that surrounds everything, but on the outside of the membrane, you have the cell wall, and that's what makes up these very rectangular, almost brick-like shapes that you're seeing. The cell wall is made of a carbohydrate. It's called cellulose. You cannot digest cellulose, although termites can. So can cows and other ruminant animals. They have ways that they can break cellulose down. When you eat cellulose, it's just excreted. Although that's good for you. That's what dietary fiber is. It's mostly the cellulose of the plants that you eat. In many plants, there is something else in the cell walls, a substance called lignin, and that locks the cellulose molecules together to form an extremely tough network. Wood is made of cellulose plus lignin, making the cell walls that make up wood extremely tough and hard and, well, as tough as wood. The difference between a tough plant part like wood and a soft plant part like, I don't know, a leaf of spinach or the petal of a flower or something like that, is the wood has much thicker cell walls, and the wood also has lignin locking together the cellulose to make something a lot stronger. This happens to be a slice through a buttercup root. The cell walls have been stained green, but the cell walls with lignin have picked up a stain that's pink. So that pink X or cross in the center right there, you're looking at a bunch of cells whose cell walls contain a lot of lignin, and they're very strong and tough. But you can see that they're surrounded by clusters of cells that are not nearly as strong. Oh, if you've ever bitten celery, celery is technically the stalk of a leaf. And you might have noticed that sometimes you get these little stringy things in your teeth when you bite a celery stalk. Those stringy things are actually strands of lignified cells, meaning that they're stronger and tougher than the cells that surround them, which don't have lignin. So there, you can actually observe the difference between lignified and unlignified cells just by eating a piece of celery. Okay, once a plant cell has a mature cell wall, it can't expand anymore. And as I mentioned, in many plant tissues, when the cell wall is complete, the cell dies and only the cell wall is left. This is a picture I took a long time ago with a gizmo we have called a transmission electron microscope. What you're looking at is a slice through cork. Yes, this is the stuff that you put into wine bottles to seal them, cork. Tiny pieces of this get pressed together and made into cork board for bulletin boards and things like that. You've all seen cork. Real cork is the outer layer of bark of a particular species of oak tree called the cork bark oak. Duh, very logical name. Native to Spain of all places. And it happens to have this very, very thick bark layer that can be peeled off without hurting the tree. The tree can just grow new layers of cork as the old layers get peeled off and made into wine bottle stoppers or what have you. And this is possible because when cork is mature, the cells die and all that's left behind are these cell walls. So peeling the cork layer off a cork bark oak doesn't hurt the tree any more than cutting your fingernails does, because your fingernails and your hair are not living tissue. And of course, they don't have any nerves, so you can't feel pain. So that's just an example of a plant tissue that's functional. It helps keep the plant, protects the plant from like bugs that would bore into it. So it's good for the tree, but when it's mature, it's actually dead. You know, just as your hair and nails are dead. This happens to be a slice the long way down the stem of a plant. So what you're looking at is a plant stem, and you can see slices through branches and leaves. And right where that red arrow is pointing is a cap of cells right at the tip. Those don't have thick cell walls. And that's the only place where cells are actively dividing to make the stem get longer. There's a few exceptions to this rule. Grass is one of them, which is why you have to mow it. But in a typical plant, the only part of the stem that's actively getting longer is at the very tip. And usually that tip is covered by baby leaves, and we call it a bud. So right at the very core of the bud at the end of a growing plant stem, you would have a little cap of cells that are actively dividing. So, for example, take a tree. A tree trunk can't get any longer than it already is. If you have a tree branch that is 6 feet off the ground, it will eternally be 6 feet off the ground because trees can't grow from below. The only places where a tree is actively growing and adding new wood are, well, first of all, at the tips of the branches, these buds. And also tree branches can grow thicker because there's cell growth going on in a ring around the branch that can add new layers of wood, but trees can't grow from the base. And these zones where you have cells that are actively dividing in a plant are called the meristems. The apical meristem is at the tip of a branch, and the lateral meristems are along the sides, and those will grow into new branches. Incidentally, if you cut off the apical meristem, the lateral meristems will start growing, which is why you prune. If you have a shrub and you cut off the apical meristems, the laterals will start growing and the plant will develop more branches and look bushier, which is why you see physical plant trimming the bushes around campus growing in the various gardens. It makes them fuller and less scraggly and more, full and thick and, well, bushy. That's why you prune decorative bushes. I'm not going to say much about how we classify plants. For what we need to do here, we can divide plants into two major subgroups. Plants that are called bryophytes. That's mosses and a few others that you may not ever notice unless you go looking for them, like plants called liverworts and hornworts. But mosses are the ones you can most easily see around here. And true mosses are plants, but they are non-vascular. What the heck does that mean? Vas is Latin for a vessel. Vascular means having to do with vessels. If you have problems with your blood vessels, you would go to see a vascular surgeon, who might do things like strip out varicose veins or something like that. And when we're talking about plants, vascular plants are plants that have specialized cells that transport water, like a plumbing system. Bryophytes don't have this. Every cell in a plant has to have water. Bryophytes don't really have specialized cells that carry water around. That means that bryophytes can't get really large. And if you look around on campus for mosses, you'll typically find them in shadowy spots that aren't exposed to full sun and that don't ever completely dry out. So mosses have to be small, and mosses have to live usually in pretty moist habitats. Okay, hang on. Somebody is there. Sorry, just letting somebody in there. So yeah, non-vascular plants cannot carry water through the plant body, which means that they're generally quite small and restricted to damp areas so that every cell in the moss can get the water that it needs. Almost all the plants that you know, everything from the trees and the grass outside to the fruits and vegetables at the store, are a different type of plant called vascular plants. Vascular plants are said to be tracheophytes. That's the same word as trachea. Your trachea is the pipe that carries air from your mouth down towards your lungs. Trachea in the case of plants. Phyto means plant, by the way, and trachea refers to the vessels that carry water through all parts of the plant. So you can have vascular plants growing in deserts that can take up water from their roots and transport it through the plant body to all parts of the plant that need it. So they don't have to be kept in moist surroundings. I guess some do, but many tracheophytes don't have to. This happens to be a slice through the stem of alfalfa. And I picked this slide because you can see the two different basic types of conducting tissue. The large, wide open cells with the thick cell walls that have stained kind of reddish pink are a type of conducting tissue called xylem. Now, xylo or xylos just happens to be the Greek word for wood. You might know it if you know what a xylophone is. Xylophone means wood sound, phono meaning sound. And a xylophone is made of bars of wood that you hit to get sound. Xylem carries water up from the roots through the stems to the leaves and everywhere it's needed. The second type of conducting tissue is called phloem, and that goes in the opposite direction. Phloem picks up the sugars that are made by photosynthesis, and those sugars are in a watery solution. That's what sap is. Sap is basically sugar syrup. And phloem transports sugars in the form of sap from the leaves where it's being made all the way down through the stems and even to the roots, right? The leaves need water. The roots need sap. The roots need sugar as food, right? The roots are living and growing. They need an energy source. And so xylem carries water up and phloem carries sap down. This particular picture happens to show the difference fairly clearly. But if I had picked, let's say, the trunk of a tree, the wood is all xylem, and then the phloem is in the inner bark of a tree. And the outer bark is the cork layer. And in the cork bark oak that we talked about, that layer happens to be very, very thick. But every tree's got some degree of cork in the outermost bark. This is why, by the way, you can kill a tree if you take an axe and cut a ring and strip off the outer and inner bark all the way around the tree. That's called girdling the tree, and that will kill it. Because now the phloem's been cut, so sugars can't get from the leaves down to the roots, and the roots will die and the tree will fall. Okay, in the time that we've got left, I want to talk about the animalia. I don't know if we'll finish, but this is the last of the four basic types of eukaryotes that I would want you to know. And when I say the word animal, people tend to think of critters like this. Mammals, fuzzy and adorable, and oh, this thing would probably eat you. Let's not kid ourselves. But when I say animal, you probably think of dogs or cats or lions or bears or gemsbok or something like that. Not everybody realizes it, but animal does not only mean the fuzzy, warm-blooded animals with big eyes. In fact, by far the largest phylum, that's the subdivision of the kingdom Animalia, by far the largest is called the Arthropoda. That means jointed legs, and that includes insects. and crabs and spiders and scorpions and centipedes and a bunch of other things you probably don't want to think about very hard. This one just happens to be a common dragonfly that I've seen in my own backyard. You'll see these around here when spring and early summer comes. Libellula lydia just happens to be a very pretty local insect. But insects are animals too. And so are sea urchins and earthworms and, oh, good grief, clams and snails and octopus and sea sponges and corals and jellyfish and this soft, fleshy, glow-in-the-dark sea pen called Panatula phosphorea. I picked this animal because it really does not look like one. It looks like, well, kind of like a feather growing out of the ocean floor. But if you saw it, the first thing you'd think would probably be, hey, that looks like a plant or a seaweed. But it's actually an animal. How can we tell? Like this. Animals are multicellular. They have cell differentiation. They're made up of many cells. You're made up of roughly 37 trillion is the estimate. And you're made up of roughly 200 different specialized cell types that do different things. If you ever take a class called histology, you'll learn about every last one of those cell types. Generally, animals are heterotrophic, which means that to get both energy and nutrients, molecules that they need to run metabolism, they have to eat other organisms. So they'll either eat autotrophs like plants, or they'll eat other heterotrophs like other animals. Most animals can move at least some stage of the life cycles. Things like corals don't move except when they are little embryos. But most animals can move at least some of their lives. That's said to be motile. Motile just means able to move. Animals are usually symmetrical in some way, which means there's at least one way in which you can divide an animal body into halves that are the same size and shape, but mirror images of each other. Not that I would ever do this, but I could take a samurai sword and split you from the top of your head straight down and divide your body into equal halves that are the same shape. They're just mirror images. I would never do such a thing, of course, unless you cheat on the exam, in which case all bets are off. But animal bodies usually have some type of symmetry. No cell walls, which is a good thing, because if you had cell walls, you would be as rigid as a tree. What locks your cells together is a meshwork of flexible fibers that we call the extracellular matrix. And I'll show you what that looks like in the next slide. And all animals, except for the very simplest, like jellyfish, their cells are organized in coordinated groupings, usually, but not always, in sheets, sometimes not. And these coordinated groupings that are specialized to do one thing are called tissues. And we'll talk about the tissue types coming up shortly, or possibly coming up on Monday, depending on how fast I talk. This happens to be a sample of the tissue underneath somebody's cheek. Right? If you touch your cheeks, you have skin, of course, on the outside, and some of you have hair on the outside. Under that skin, you have this very plump and springy, flexible tissue that just kind of fills out the outlines of your face. If you're old, you don't have nearly as much of this, which makes your skin start to sag. But if you are still in the prime of youth, you still have this plump and spongy stuff between the skin of your face and the muscles that move your face. This is just called loose alveolar connective tissue. Don't worry about that name, but this is a little piece of it that has been sliced very thin, stained with a chemical stain, and put on a microscope slide. And what you're seeing, the reason I picked this is you can actually see a blood vessel towards the upper right, but most of this, you can see some dark dots. Those are the nuclei of cells, but they're surrounded by this stringy blue stuff that looks a little bit like cotton candy. That stringy blue stuff that makes up most of what you can see on this slide is extracellular matrix. It's what locks all of those cells together. And it happens to be a very springy type of protein, and it's a protein called collagen. Some of you might know that plastic surgeons can inject collagen under the skin, which they can do to, plump up your cheeks if they're starting to fade, or inject it into your behind if you want a fuller and plumper Kardashian-style posterior. Yeah, no comment there. Or inject it into your lips if you want fuller lips and things like that. Collagen injections get used as a plastic surgery technique. What they're injecting is more of the stuff that looks like blue cotton candy in this picture. It's not cells, it's the stuff outside the cells that holds them together, the extracellular matrix. Blood is actually a tissue, but in this case, the extracellular matrix happens to be a liquid. This is a picture taken through a microscope of blood cells. Red blood cells don't have nuclei when they're mature, and they carry oxygen. The grainy thing at the upper left is a white blood cell, and the nucleus there looks a little bit like a clover leaf. That's that darker purple blobby thing inside the white blood cell. And what all of these cells are floating in is a liquid extracellular matrix called the plasma. You might have heard of people donating plasma for medical uses and, to afford textbooks these days and things like that. Well, that's what plasma is. It's liquid extracellular matrix. Okay, I'll tell you what, I'm getting a sense that we're coming up on time. I was going to talk about the 4 basic types of tissue, epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscle. But by the power vested to me by the state of Arkansas, I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and we'll pick up talking about tissue types on Monday, and I will go ahead and stop the recording.